How important is it that that the United States diversify its supply chain from China?
It's critical to diversify that supply chain, and I think we're seeing that right now with the pandemic. And so this is an effort that we've been doing for the last couple of years, and now it's being turbocharged because of that pandemic. And I think a lot of it's brought on by citizens around the world realizing some of the things that's going on with the Communist Party of China. And I think the president did a great job of waking up the United States, but I think everybody sees China's, what I would affectionately call their three-pronged strategy of concealment, co-option, and coercion. So if you look at the virus, the pandemic is a result of the concealment of that virus. If you look at their face masks, their so-called face mask diplomacy, where they are seducing, coercing countries to do things and using that PPE as collateral. And then the third thing is, I think people have woken up and they see that China has co-opted a lot of the economies by entangling supply chains. So it's critical for national security as well as economic security.
Let me follow up on that face mask diplomacy. Are you concerned that China might be dangling PPE to our U.S. allies to really try to get them to get even more entangled in 5G network?
By the way, I think we're seeing that around the world, and it's a classic part of their three-pronged strategy. Yeah. I think understanding the dangers of 5G from an untrusted vendor. And Secretary Pompeo announced on April 29th the Clean Path program, which basically calls for any network traffic coming in and out of diplomatic facilities, whether it's here or abroad, all our embassies, it requires a clean path. So in other words, it's trusted, it's reliable. It cannot have touched, for example, a Huawei antenna. And we expect other countries and companies to make those same requirements.
Before we come back to domestic politics, sticking with international, this economic prosperity network, how important is that the U.S. develop that, not just with U.S.-based companies, but also internationally?
Yeah, so if you look at the economic prosperity network, it's core to our economic security strategy. There's three pillars in that. The first one is turbocharge economic competitiveness. The second is safeguard America's assets. The third one is the economic prosperity network. And what that means is forming an alliance, a network with trusted partners. And so the economic prosperity network is comprised of like-minded countries, companies, and civil society for all areas of economic collaboration and in all industries. So digital, so energy, infrastructure, even money flows, education, research, logistics, supply chains is a key part of that. And the key is that this economic prosperity network operate by a set of trust standards, things that we would call American values here in the U.S. In Europe, they'd call them democratic values, and probably the best international translation is trust principles. And those are things like accountability, integrity, transparency, reciprocity, respect for rule of law, respect for property of all kinds, respect for sovereignty of nations, respect for the planet, respect for labor. And I think this is what the world has been asking for. And I've probably had about 60 bilateral meetings over the last year in terms of different countries' economic ministers, foreign ministers, finance ministers, and this really resonates. And they want America to lead. They go, we need America to lead.
Keith, how do you do that, though, when several of our allies have already formed relationships with China, with Huawei on 5G?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that China is a big trading partner, and in a lot of countries, their number one trading partner. But for these countries, it all comes down to one word, and it's trust. And by the way, coming from the business sector my entire career, trust is the basis of every relationship, business-wise, personal or otherwise. And when you talk to these government officials, or even when you talk to companies, international companies, it's that issue of trust comes up with China. And I think what has really accelerated this is what's happened in the pandemic, because I think people really understand that this should have never happened.
And meanwhile, domestically, the State Department has also been trying to do new significant outreach pertaining to economic security strategy to make sure that the U.S. supply systems, both from technologies, from energy and other sectors, are better protected against economic threats. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, because one of those core pillars for the economic security strategy is safeguard American assets. So that's...
And what does that look like? As people hear that thrown around.
So here's what it looks like. So first of all, it's intellectual property, it's technology, it's supply chains, it's financial systems. And a lot of people don't realize of the 150 some Chinese stocks that are listed on the New York and NASDAQ Stock Exchange, they don't have to do Sarbanes-Oxley, which means go through big scrutiny in terms of audit, and they can't be audited. And for a guy who's taken 4 companies public, personally, maybe I have a problem with that, but I'm thinking of the shareholders, and because that lack of transparency is not good. The other key assets to safeguard is our education system, our healthcare system, all of those kind of things, and that's why not only are we looking at it from a supply chain standpoint, but we're also looking at in terms of Chinese investment in our CFIUS process as well.
Just a final question. I want to come back to this point of face mask diplomacy and the concern that I hear from you, that I hear from Democrats, Republicans alike on Capitol Hill about China dangling face masks and PPE to U.S. allies.
Yeah.
And the potential for that happening on U.S. supply chains, if that is so entangled. That's got to worry you.
Yeah, and by the way, I think if you look at this China issue, this is probably the most unifying bipartisan issue ever. I mean, everybody has a passion for that. And, it's Chinese doctrine. It's not just deception, but it's also seduce with money and reinforce with intimidation and retaliation, right? I mean, we all saw what happened to the general manager of the Houston Rockets when he just did a 7-word tweet. Within 24 hours, $100 million of sponsorships were dropped by Chinese apparel companies. Now, that just doesn't happen by accident. That's a playbook, because that has to go to the top, and even the government of China can't move that fast. So I think this is on the minds of our Congress, our executive branch, our judicial branch. I think it's on the minds of companies. We could really see that when I hosted Secretary Pompeo out in Silicon Valley for 4 days. I hosted 36 of the top CEOs in my home, and as they went around the room, we had them tell their China story, and they were kind of frightening. But and we see the same thing in other countries. I did the same thing with a set of 25 German CEOs. You've got to be in a closed-door setting because all these guys are afraid of retaliation. And I think our stance, an important role for America, is there is strength and power in leadership in terms of unity and solidarity. And this is where the Economic Prosperity Network is key, because it creates a network of alliance under these trust principles. And this pandemic, is such a horrible thing. But if there's any byproduct out of that, I think it will set the table for the future with the Economic Prosperity Network.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.